Rick Ross may be facing his biggest pressure test in years, because this time the shots are coming from two completely different directions. On one side you have 50 Cent, the longtime rival who has been waiting for almost 2 decades to turn every weak moment into another punchline. On the other side is Drake, a former collaborator whose relationship with Ross completely changed after the explosive rap battles of 2024. And now, both names are keeping Rick Ross at the center of a conversation he probably doesn't want. 50 Cent is pointing to album numbers, streaming performance, concert footage, and the question everyone is asking: is Rick Ross still moving like the superstar he once was? But Ross isn't backing down. He's pointing towards something much bigger than one album or 1 week of sales. 20 years in the game, a massive catalog, business ventures, luxury assets, and a career that survived multiple generations of hip-hop. So who's really winning? Is Rick Ross losing his grip on the music game? Or are 50 Cent and Drake judging his career by the wrong scoreboard? Because when you put all three stories together, this situation gets a lot more complicated than it looks. Rick Ross has been in the rap game long enough to understand that attention can be both a blessing and a weapon. When people are talking about you, your name stays alive. But when the people talking about you are 50 Cent and Drake, the conversation can become something completely different. These aren't random critics looking for a headline. Both men have real history with Ross, and both have reasons to keep his name in the spotlight. For 50 Cent, this goes back nearly 2 decades. Before the luxury properties, massive cars, private jets, business ventures, and the larger-than-life image that became synonymous with Rick Ross, there was another part of his past that 50 Cent decided would become the center of their rivalry. Ross had previously worked as a correctional officer, and 50 saw an opportunity that he simply wasn't going to ignore. Ross had built his public identity around being the boss, the hustler, the larger-than-life figure who represented a certain version of Miami street culture. But 50 believed that Ross' background gave him the perfect opening for one of the most relentless trolling campaigns hip-hop had ever seen. The rivalry exploded after Ross released Mafia Music in 2009, a track that contained lines widely interpreted as shots toward 50 Cent. Once 50 decided to respond, the situation quickly moved beyond a normal rap battle. He introduced the nickname Officer Ricky, turning Ross' former job into a recurring joke. It wasn't just a diss record and then silence. 50 used interviews, videos, social media, comedy, and public appearances to keep the attack alive. That was one of 50 Cent's biggest strengths as a rival. He understood that a rap beef doesn't have to stay inside the music. He could take one detail about an opponent and repeat it so many times that eventually the joke became part of the public conversation. Ross tried to respond through music and public comments, but 50 kept finding new ways to keep the story alive. One of the most controversial parts of the feud involved Ross' former partner, Tia Kemp, who became connected to 50's campaign against him. What had started as two rappers trading records had now become deeply personal. And that is what makes the relationship between these two men so interesting in 2026. A lot of rap rivalries disappear once the artists move on to different eras. New albums come out. New artists become popular. The old arguments stop mattering. That never completely happened with 50 Cent and Rick Ross. Even when they weren't directly going at each other, the history remained. Every time Ross had a major moment, there was always a possibility that 50 would have something to say. And every time 50 mentioned Ross, people remembered the old feud. For 50, Ross became one of those names that could always generate a reaction. That's why the current situation is bigger than one album. When Rick Ross released Set in Stone, the project immediately created another opportunity for the old rivalry to return. Instead of allowing the album to simply exist as another release from a veteran artist, 50 focused attention on its commercial performance. Reports and early figures became part of the conversation, with numbers around the low 20,000 range being discussed for the first week. 50 saw exactly what he needed. He had numbers. And numbers are dangerous in a rap beef because they can be interpreted in completely different ways. To Ross, one album's opening week doesn't define 20 years of work. To 50, the current scoreboard is the point. That's where their arguments completely separate. 50's message is basically simple. If you're still calling yourself one of the biggest names in hip-hop, the current audience should be able to prove it. Ross sees things differently. He has repeatedly emphasized longevity, ownership, streaming, business ventures, and the fact that he has remained active after roughly 20 years in an industry where most artists disappear much faster. And that creates the central argument surrounding Rick Ross right now. Is a veteran rapper supposed to be judged by the same standards as a young artist? If a new rapper releases an album and doesn't generate major numbers, people may immediately question whether that artist has a future. But Rick Ross isn't a new rapper. His biggest records were created during a completely different era of the music business. Physical albums mattered more. CD sales mattered more. Radio mattered more. Streaming wasn't even part of the equation. Ross entered the mainstream during the era when Port of Miami helped establish him as one of the most recognizable voices in Southern hip-hop. That album wasn't just a commercial release. It established the character, the voice, the imagery, the luxury, the larger-than-life boss persona. And over the years, Ross turned that identity into an entire brand. That's why simply looking at one opening week number doesn't tell the entire story. But here's the uncomfortable part for Ross. 50 Cent isn't necessarily saying Rick Ross has no money. He's questioning whether Ross still has the same cultural power. Those are two completely different arguments. A person can be wealthy and still be past their commercial peak. A rapper can own valuable assets and still struggle to generate the same excitement around new music. An artist can have a legendary catalog, while newer audiences pay less attention to new releases. And that's where 50's argument becomes much harder for Ross to dismiss. Because 50 isn't necessarily asking, "Are you broke?" He's asking, "Can you still move the culture the way you used to?" That question becomes even more interesting when you look at the way 50 approaches his trolling. He doesn't need to prove that Ross is finished. He only needs to create enough doubt for the audience to start asking the question themselves. If an album opens lower than expected, 50 can joke about it. If a concert clip appears to show empty seats, 50 can post it. If Ross says something about him, 50 can respond. Every individual moment becomes another piece of the same narrative. And once that narrative starts spreading online, the original context almost becomes irrelevant. People aren't debating the music anymore. They're debating whether Rick Ross is falling off. That is a much bigger conversation. Ross has tried to push the discussion in the opposite direction. Instead of allowing the conversation to stay focused on first-week sales, he points toward everything else he's built. His catalog, his businesses, his investments, his properties, his brand, his luxury lifestyle, his ability to remain visible after 2 decades. From his perspective, those things are evidence that the long game is working. And to be fair, longevity in hip-hop is difficult. There are countless artists who were massive for 2 or 3 years and then completely disappeared. Rick Ross didn't disappear. He continued releasing music, touring, collaborating, building businesses, and maintaining a recognizable public identity. That alone separates him from many artists who came into the game around the same period. But 50 Cent doesn't appear interested in giving Ross credit simply for surviving. That's the difference. Ross is playing the long game. 50 is attacking the present. And when those two definitions of success collide, the argument becomes almost impossible to settle. Then there is another problem. The internet doesn't care about nuance. If one screenshot shows a low number, people will share it. If one video shows empty seats, people will repost it. If one rapper makes a joke, millions of viewers may see the joke before they ever see the explanation. That is exactly why 50 Cent's style has remained so effective. He understands how quickly a simple insult can become a larger story. And Rick Ross understands the same media game. Instead of staying quiet, he often responds with his own jokes, flexes, and counterattacks. That keeps the rivalry alive. It's almost a cycle. 50 says something about Ross. Ross responds. People talk about both. 50 sees the reaction. Then he responds again. And suddenly a feud that started back in 2009 is back on everyone's timeline. But there is another layer that makes the situation even more complicated. 50 Cent isn't the only major name connected to Rick Ross' current controversy. Drake is also part of the story. And unlike 50 Cent, Drake wasn't always an enemy. At one point, Drake and Rick Ross were collaborators. They shared records. They appeared together. They had a professional relationship that made sense in the music industry. Both artists had enormous audiences, and their collaborations helped create some memorable moments. But everything changed during the major rap conflict that exploded in 2024. Rick Ross eventually found himself on the opposite side of Drake. What made that fallout especially interesting was the history between them. This wasn't a random rapper attacking Drake for attention. This was someone Drake had previously worked with. Ross released music and comments aimed at Drake during the conflict, while Drake responded through his own public statements, social media activity, and music-related exchanges. The situation became personal quickly, and once that relationship broke down, there was no easy way to put it back together. Now, years later, that history still matters, because when Drake makes a joke, drops a line, or does something that fans believe could be connected to an old rival, social media immediately starts connecting the dots. That's where caution becomes important. Not every vague reference is automatically a diss. Not every joke is confirmation. Not every image or reaction means what fans think it means. But the fact that people immediately associate Drake's activity with Rick Ross shows just how much unfinished tension remains around their relationship. And now Rick Ross has two completely different enemies connected to his name. 50 Cent represents the old war. Drake represents the newer war. 50 has been questioning Ross' relevance for years. Drake represents a more recent chapter involving a former collaborator and one of the biggest rap conflicts of the modern era. And Ross is caught in the middle. That's what makes the current situation so interesting. If 50 Cent attacks Ross, people remember Officer Ricky. If Drake is connected to another Ross-related conversation, people remember the 2024 fallout. And if Ross releases music that doesn't perform like his biggest records, both storylines can suddenly become relevant again. But there's one thing Ross still has that neither feud can erase. History. Port of Miami came out almost 20 years ago. Ross has survived multiple changes in hip-hop. He has watched entire generations of rappers become stars and then disappear. He has remained recognizable. He has built a catalog. He has built businesses. And he has maintained a lifestyle that continues to attract attention. So maybe the real question isn't whether Rick Ross is still the exact same superstar he was at his commercial peak. Almost nobody can maintain that level forever. The real question is whether a decline in music numbers means the entire Rick Ross empire is declining with it. And that's where this story gets even more complicated. Because 50 Cent is looking at the scoreboard in front of him, Rick Ross is looking at the scoreboard behind him, and Drake is standing somewhere in the middle of that history, reminding everyone that the old relationships in hip-hop never really disappear. They just wait for the next moment to explode again. The moment the conversation around Rick Ross shifted from old rap beef to current numbers, the entire situation became much more serious. Because now 50 Cent wasn't simply reminding people about Officer Ricky or bringing up a feud from 2009. He was asking whether Rick Ross could still command the same attention in today's music industry that he once did. And that is a much harder question to answer. For years, Rick Ross has been able to operate from a position of strength. Even when a project didn't dominate the charts, his name remained recognizable. Even when newer artists took over the conversation, Ross continued to appear at major events, release music, collaborate with artists, and maintain the larger-than-life image that had become part of his identity. But Set in Stone changed the conversation. The album was supposed to be another statement from a veteran rapper who had spent roughly 2 decades building a career. Instead, the attention quickly moved toward its reported sales and streaming performance. Numbers began circulating online. Some reports and discussions pointed toward roughly 22,000 units in the first week, while later numbers and streaming figures were discussed as part of a broader argument about the album's performance. The exact figures matter, but so does the context. Early projections, unofficial estimates, streaming equivalents, and final certified chart results are not always the same thing. That distinction is important. But in a rap feud, nuance doesn't always survive. 50 Cent saw the headline and immediately understood what it could become. He started clowning Ross online, suggesting that the numbers represented another sign that the Miami rapper's commercial power was fading. And this is where 50's strategy becomes obvious. He wasn't reviewing the album. He wasn't discussing the production. He wasn't debating which songs were good. He was attacking the idea of Rick Ross as a current superstar. That's a completely different type of attack. If 50 can convince people that Ross is no longer commercially relevant, then every future release becomes part of the same argument. A lower opening week becomes evidence. A quiet concert becomes evidence. A weak social media response becomes evidence. A smaller headline becomes evidence. Even something completely unrelated can eventually be pulled into the same narrative. That's how a trolling campaign grows. And Ross wasn't about to let that narrative go unanswered. He pushed back by emphasizing the long game. His argument was that artists today can manipulate numbers, generate huge streaming totals, and create the appearance of massive success without necessarily building the same long-term value outside music. Ross has questioned the idea that first-week numbers alone should define a rapper's success. He has pointed toward his catalog, his ownership, his business ventures, and the fact that he is still active decades after entering the industry. That argument has some weight, because music has changed dramatically. A rapper who sold hundreds of thousands of physical albums in the 2000s is now competing in an environment where a listener can stream a song hundreds of times without ever purchasing a physical copy. Streaming also creates complicated measurements. One person's idea of success may be first-week sales. Another person's idea may be total streams over months. Another may look at touring. Another may look at catalog value. Another may look at business revenue. And another may simply ask whether people still care. Those measurements can produce completely different answers. That's why the Rick Ross debate refuses to die. If you measure him against his peak, the difference is obvious. If you measure him against other artists who have survived for 20 years, the picture changes. And if you measure him against his entire business empire, the music numbers become only one part of the equation. But 50 Cent doesn't seem interested in that broader scoreboard. He knows that the easiest way to embarrass an opponent is to focus on the one number that hurts the most. And when Ross' album performance became a topic, 50 had exactly what he needed. He also began bringing up concert footage. One of the clips circulating online appeared to show large sections of empty or available seats around a Rick Ross performance. 50 used the footage as another opportunity to question Ross' drawing power. But here's where the story needs to slow down. A clip of a venue does not automatically prove the final attendance for an entire concert. The camera may only show one section. The footage could have been recorded before the show filled up. The venue may have blocked certain areas. Tickets can be held for production reasons. And a short social media video is not the same thing as an official attendance report. So while the footage can become part of the online conversation, it shouldn't automatically be treated as proof that Rick Ross couldn't sell tickets. Still, 50 didn't need an official attendance report. He needed a viral clip. And he got one. That's the difference between internet warfare and traditional journalism. The point isn't always to establish the final truth. Sometimes the point is simply to create a question that everyone starts discussing. And once the question is out there, the target is forced to respond. Ross responded in his own way. Instead of accepting the idea that his career should be judged by one album or one concert, he pointed toward everything else he had built. His catalog, his properties, his businesses, his luxury vehicles, his private aircraft, his investments, his ability to remain visible, his 20 years in the industry. From Ross' perspective, the critics are looking at one chapter while ignoring the entire book. And that is where the feud with 50 becomes almost philosophical. 50 Cent's career has always been built around proving that he can survive. He came into the industry with an aggressive style, turned controversy into attention, and eventually expanded far beyond music, television, film, business, branding, entrepreneurship. He understood early that the music could create the platform, but the platform could become bigger than the music. So when 50 attacks Ross for weak music numbers, there is an obvious counterargument. 50 himself has spent years building businesses outside of music. That means Ross can essentially turn the same philosophy back on him. If a rapper has built enough outside the studio, why should one album determine whether that person is winning? But 50 has an answer to that too. He isn't necessarily saying Ross has no money. He's saying money doesn't automatically equal cultural dominance. And that's a much more difficult argument to defeat. Someone can own expensive cars and still make music nobody listens to. Someone can own property and still have declining relevance. Someone can be wealthy and still be past their prime as a recording artist. Those things can exist at the same time. That's why the debate around Rick Ross is more complicated than the headlines make it sound. Then another issue entered the conversation: Ross touring. The idea of an artist celebrating a major anniversary can be powerful. It allows a veteran rapper to revisit the music that originally built his audience. For Ross, the 20th anniversary surrounding Port of Miami gives him exactly that opportunity. The album helped introduce his larger-than-life style to mainstream audiences in 2006. 2 decades later, he can still build performances around that catalog. That matters, because if people are still willing to buy tickets to hear music that was released 20 years ago, then the catalog still has value. It doesn't necessarily prove that the artist is at the same commercial level he was during his peak, but it does prove that the music survived. And survival is one of the hardest things to achieve in hip-hop. Think about how many rappers were considered unstoppable 20 years ago. Some disappeared. Some retired. Some lost their audience. Some stopped releasing music altogether. Ross remained. That doesn't mean every new release will perform like Port of Miami. It means his career has developed a second layer. The music is no longer the only thing. The catalog itself has become an asset. And that brings us to another part of Ross' public image: business. For years, Ross has presented himself as more than a rapper. His lifestyle has become part of the brand. Large properties, luxury vehicles, private travel, business ventures, investments, real estate ambitions. The image isn't subtle. Ross wants people to see someone who has moved beyond simply making records. That image is one reason the argument with 50 is so entertaining, because both men are essentially telling the audience the same thing in different ways. They both want you to believe they are winning. 50 points to influence business moves, entertainment projects, and the ability to turn almost any situation into attention. Ross points to his accumulated wealth, lifestyle, catalog, longevity, and continued ability to generate opportunities. So who is right? That depends entirely on the scoreboard. But then Drake enters the picture again. And this changes everything. Because 50 Cent and Rick Ross have been enemies for so long that nobody is surprised when they attack each other. Drake is different. Drake and Ross once worked together. They had music together. They had mutual respect at different points in their careers. Their collaborations made sense because both artists understood how to create records that could dominate attention. But the 2024 rap conflict changed that relationship. Rick Ross became increasingly vocal against Drake, and Drake responded. The situation escalated alongside one of the biggest rap battles of the decade. Future, Metro Boomin, Kendrick Lamar, Drake. Multiple artists were involved in a conflict that dominated hip-hop conversation, and Ross chose his position. Once he did that, his relationship with Drake was never going to be the same. Now, during Drake's newer era and public activity, fans are watching closely for references to former rivals. That includes Rick Ross. But this is where we have to separate confirmed information from fan speculation. If Drake directly names someone or clearly references a specific situation, that's one thing. If fans see a vague line, image, reaction, or joke and decide it must be about Ross, that's interpretation. Social media has a tendency to turn interpretation into fact within minutes. A random comment becomes a diss. A facial expression becomes a message. A lyric becomes a secret warning. A picture becomes evidence. And suddenly an entire story exists that neither artist actually confirmed. But even when the interpretation isn't confirmed, the reaction still matters. Because it shows that audiences haven't forgotten the conflict. Rick Ross' name remains connected to Drake's. And that gives Ross another problem. 50 Cent can attack his past. Drake can represent his more recent past. And both conflicts can resurface whenever Ross has a major moment. That's exactly what happened with Set in Stone. Instead of the conversation simply being about a new Rick Ross album, people started discussing 50 Cent. Then they started discussing Drake. Then they started discussing Ross' old catalog. Then his businesses. Then his touring. Then his relevance. The album became a doorway into a much larger debate about the entire Rick Ross brand. And that is probably the most important part of this story. Because if the album had been a massive commercial success, 50's argument would have been much harder to make. If Ross had opened with huge numbers, packed every venue, and dominated social media, the narrative would have been completely different. But because the numbers became a question, 50 had an opening. And once 50 sees an opening, he rarely lets it go. That's been his pattern for years. Find the weakness. Make it funny. Repeat it. Turn it into a headline. Then wait for the target to respond. If they respond emotionally, the story becomes even bigger. And Ross has shown repeatedly that he isn't afraid to respond. That's what makes their feud so durable. Neither side truly wants to walk away. But here's where Ross may have an advantage that 50's jokes can't completely erase. He has already survived the hardest part. The industry has changed. The audience has changed. The business model has changed. The artists around him have changed. And somehow Rick Ross is still here. The question is whether still here is enough. Because being respected as a veteran is one thing. Being a dominant current superstar is another. And that's the exact line 50 Cent is trying to draw. Ross wants people to look at the entire empire. 50 wants them to look at the current moment. Meanwhile, Drake's involvement adds another layer because it shows that Ross isn't only dealing with an old enemy. He's also dealing with the fallout from a relationship that once represented one of the strongest collaborations in his career. So now the pressure is coming from both directions. One rival says the music isn't moving like it used to. Another former collaborator remains connected to unresolved tension. And Ross has to decide whether to fight every battle or simply keep building his own world. But that's where the next chapter becomes even more interesting. Because if Ross really believes that the long game matters more than first-week numbers, then his businesses, catalog, investments, and future projects become more important than anything 50 Cent posts online. And one of those future projects could potentially change the entire conversation. Because while everyone is arguing about album sales, concert footage, and old rap beefs, Rick Ross is trying to prove that his empire doesn't depend entirely on music anymore. And if he succeeds, 50's favorite weapon, the current music scoreboard, may not be enough to tell the whole story. But if the music continues declining while the hype around his new projects gets weaker, then 50's argument becomes much harder to ignore. And that's exactly why Rick Ross' next moves matter so much. Because the question is no longer simply whether 50 Cent can embarrass him. The question is whether Rick Ross can prove that there is still something bigger behind the music than the numbers people are seeing right now. And this is where the Rick Ross story becomes much bigger than 50 Cent making jokes about an album or Drake reminding fans about an old feud. Because when you step back and look at everything happening around Ross, the real battle is no longer just about who can deliver the better insult. It is about whether Rick Ross can still prove that the empire he built is bigger than any one moment in music. That distinction matters. For almost 20 years, Rick Ross has built a career around the idea that he is the boss. The music introduced the character, but the character eventually became a brand. The brand became businesses. The businesses became investments. And those investments helped create a lifestyle that Ross constantly puts on display. So when 50 Cent points toward album numbers, Ross can point somewhere else. He can point to the catalog. He can point to the properties. He can point to the businesses. He can point to the partnerships. He can point to the fact that people are still talking about him after 2 decades. But the problem is that none of those things completely answer the question 50 is asking. Is Rick Ross still a major force in music right now? That is the uncomfortable question. And there is a difference between being successful and being culturally dominant. A rapper can be extremely wealthy and still be past the peak of their musical influence. A rapper can have a legendary catalog and struggle to make a new release feel like an event. A rapper can sell out some venues while having other dates that don't perform as strongly. Those things can all happen at the same time. That is why the debate surrounding Rick Ross cannot be settled with one screenshot, one album number, or one viral video. And honestly, that's what makes the situation so interesting. 50 Cent has one scoreboard. Rick Ross has another. And Drake brings a third layer into the equation. Let's start with 50. His argument is brutally simple. If Rick Ross still considers himself one of the biggest names in hip-hop, then the audience should show it. The streaming numbers should show it. The album performance should show it. The concert demand should show it. The online conversation should show it. And if those signals are weaker than they were during Ross' peak, 50 sees that as evidence. He doesn't need to prove that Ross is broke. He doesn't need to prove that Ross has no business interests. He doesn't even need to prove that Ross has stopped making good music. He only needs to argue that Ross is no longer operating at the same level of cultural power. That is a much easier argument to make, because almost every veteran artist eventually experiences some version of it. The music industry is built around youth, novelty, and constant change. The artist dominating the conversation today won't necessarily dominate it 10 years from now. That's simply how the business works. But Ross has one thing working in his favor. He isn't pretending he just entered the game. He's been doing this for approximately 2 decades. That means his expectations should probably be different from those placed on a 20-year-old artist trying to break through. And this is where his long game argument becomes important. Ross has repeatedly emphasized that his career is not only about selling a massive number of albums in the first week. He has talked about streaming. He has talked about his catalog. He has talked about ownership. He has talked about business. He has talked about creating assets that remain valuable after the music stops dominating the headlines. That's a completely different definition of winning. Imagine 2 rappers. One releases an album and sells hundreds of thousands of copies, but has no significant business outside music. Another releases an album that performs modestly but owns valuable assets, controls parts of a catalog, has investments, businesses, and decades of recognizable music. Which one is more successful? There isn't one universal answer. It depends on what you're measuring. And that's exactly why the Rick Ross debate keeps going in circles. 50 measures the present. Ross measures the lifetime. But then there is another issue. Relevance isn't only about money. Cultural relevance is different. People can respect a veteran rapper without actively listening to every new release. People can admire an artist's old music without caring about their newest album. People can recognize a brand without following the artist's current creative direction. That's why catalog power and current relevance should not be treated as the same thing. Rick Ross has proven that his catalog has staying power. The bigger question is whether he can continue creating new moments that feel just as important. And that's where Set in Stone becomes important again. Not because one album determines his entire career. Doesn't. But because every new release gives critics a chance to compare the present Rick Ross with the version of Rick Ross that became a superstar. That comparison is brutal. Because fans remember the era when Ross releases felt like major events. They remember Hustlin'. They remember Port of Miami. They remember the luxury imagery. They remember the huge collaborations. They remember the energy surrounding his early career. And when an artist has created that kind of legacy, every new project gets measured against it. That's not necessarily fair. But it's reality. And 50 Cent understands that better than almost anyone. He doesn't need to convince people that Rick Ross was never great. In fact, admitting that Ross had a major career can make the current criticism even more effective. The argument becomes, you were once here. Now you're here. Look at the difference. That's the psychological angle behind the trolling. It's not about destroying the past. It's about making people question the present. And then Drake enters that picture. Drake's relationship with Ross creates an entirely different kind of pressure, because there was once genuine professional history between them. They weren't always enemies. They made music together. They benefited from each other's popularity. They were part of the same broader hip-hop ecosystem. Then the relationship collapsed during the explosive rap conflict of 2024. Rick Ross openly participated in the anti-Drake conversation. Drake responded. The friendship became rivalry. And once that happens between 2 artists with such massive audiences, every future interaction can become part of the story. That's why Drake's newer era has people watching. Fans aren't just listening to the music. They're analyzing. They're looking for references. They're looking for names. They're looking for visual clues. They're looking for jokes. They're looking for anything that might connect back to the old conflict. But again, there is an important distinction. A fan theory is not automatically a fact. If Drake directly says something about Rick Ross, that's evidence. If fans interpret a vague line as a Ross reference, that's speculation. And in the current social media environment, that distinction gets lost almost instantly. A 15-second clip can create an entire news cycle. A joke can become a headline. A reaction can become a theory. And suddenly millions of people are discussing something that neither artist officially confirmed. For Rick Ross, though, the effect is still real. His name remains attached to one of the biggest rap conflicts of the decade. That means his relevance isn't necessarily disappearing. It may simply be changing. Instead of being discussed only because of new music, he's being discussed because of history, rivalries, business, lifestyle, and legacy. That's not the same as being the hottest rapper in the game, but it is still attention. And attention has always been one of the most valuable currencies in entertainment. Now look at what Ross is doing outside the studio. One of the most interesting developments is his involvement with real estate and development projects in Miami. The significance isn't simply the size of a proposed project. The bigger point is that Ross is attaching his name to something designed to exist beyond the life cycle of an album. That's exactly the kind of move that supports his long game argument. An album can be hot for 3 months. A building can exist for decades. A song can trend for a week. An investment can potentially continue producing value for years. That doesn't mean every project will succeed. It doesn't mean every promotional figure attached to a development should be accepted as fact. And it doesn't mean a business venture automatically proves financial dominance. But it does show how Ross wants his career to evolve. He doesn't want to remain dependent on music alone. That's actually one of the smartest things a veteran artist can do. Because music careers are unpredictable. Your voice changes. The audience changes. Trends change. Platforms change. But if an artist can convert fame into long-term assets, then declining music numbers don't necessarily mean declining wealth. That's the model both Ross and 50 Cent understand. And that's another reason their rivalry is so fascinating. They actually have more in common than either would probably admit. Both became famous through music. Both built recognizable brands. Both moved into business. Both understand the value of attention. Both know how to use controversy. And both have successfully kept their names in public conversation long after their early musical peaks. The difference is how they use that attention. 50 uses conflict as fuel. Ross uses lifestyle and status as fuel. 50 wants to make you laugh at his opponent. Ross wants to make you admire what he has built. That's 2 completely different marketing strategies. And right now both are working. People are still watching. People are still arguing. People are still clicking. And Rick Ross' name is still generating conversation. But the biggest question remains. Is the attention helping him or hurting him? Because there is a dangerous side to being constantly involved in celebrity beef. If every conversation around your name is about another rapper, people can eventually stop talking about your actual work. Instead of discussing the music, they're discussing 50. Instead of discussing the album, they're discussing Drake. Instead of discussing the tour, they're discussing ticket screenshots. Instead of discussing business, they're discussing insults. That's a problem. An artist wants their work to become the headline, not the person criticizing them. And this is where Ross could potentially change the narrative. The easiest way to answer 50 Cent may not be with another insult. It may be with results. Drop a record that catches fire. Put together a show that people can't stop talking about. Release another project that reminds everyone why you became a major star. Build a business that speaks for itself. Create something that can't be reduced to a meme. Because the strongest response to someone saying you're finished isn't an argument. It's success. And Ross understands that. That's why he keeps talking about the long game. He knows that a career lasting 20 years is already an achievement. But longevity creates a different responsibility. You have to prove that you're not simply surviving. You have to prove that you're still evolving. That's the difference between being remembered and remaining relevant. And this is where Port of Miami becomes important again. The 20th anniversary of that album isn't just a celebration of old music. It's a reminder of how long Ross has been part of the culture. That album arrived in 2006. Entire generations have grown up since then. Artists who were children when Ross first became famous are now established names themselves. The fact that Ross can still build performances around that catalog demonstrates something. His music created memories that lasted. But again, nostalgia is not the same thing as dominance. A sold-out anniversary show celebrating a classic album tells you the catalog matters. It doesn't necessarily tell you that the newest album has the same cultural impact. And that's exactly the distinction critics like 50 Cent are trying to exploit. So perhaps both sides are right. 50 may be right that Rick Ross isn't moving music like he did at his peak. Ross may be right that a single album doesn't erase 20 years of success. Drake may be right to remain distant from someone he no longer considers an ally. And fans may be right to question whether Ross can still command the same level of attention without relying on old rivalries. All of these things can exist simultaneously. That is what makes this story more interesting than a simple "who won the beef" video. Because there isn't one scoreboard. There are several. On current music momentum, 50 has an argument. On longevity, Ross has an argument. On catalog value, Ross has an argument. On social media influence, 50 has an argument. On sheer current star power, Drake remains one of the biggest names in the conversation. And when those three worlds overlap, Rick Ross finds himself in a strange position. He may not be at the commercial peak of his career, but he is still impossible to ignore. And that alone tells us something. If Rick Ross were truly irrelevant, 50 Cent wouldn't get nearly as much attention from talking about him. If nobody cared about the Drake conflict anymore, every new reference wouldn't generate discussion. If Ross had completely disappeared, his anniversary performances and business ventures wouldn't create headlines. The fact that everyone is still debating him means his name still carries weight. The question is, what kind of weight? Is it the weight of a current superstar? The weight of a respected veteran? The weight of a businessman? The weight of a legendary catalog? Or simply the weight of someone who has spent 20 years building a recognizable brand? Maybe it's all of them. And perhaps that's what 50 Cent doesn't want people to focus on. Because if the audience starts looking at the entire picture instead of one album number, the argument becomes much harder to simplify. Rick Ross may have lost some of the commercial heat that surrounded him years ago. That happens to almost every artist. But losing some heat isn't the same as losing everything. And that distinction could define the next stage of his career. The pressure from 50 Cent isn't going away. Their history is too deep. The jokes are too easy. The audience reaction is too strong. And Drake's relationship with Ross remains complicated enough that another moment could bring that story back to the front of the conversation. But Ross doesn't necessarily need to defeat either man. He needs to outlast the noise. That's something he's already done before. He's survived changes in music. He's survived new generations. He's survived old controversies. He's survived one of the longest rap feuds of the modern era. And he's still here. Now he has to prove that being here is enough. Because the next chapter won't be decided by what 50 Cent says. It won't be decided by what Drake says. It will be decided by what Rick Ross does next. If he delivers a major musical moment, builds successful businesses, continues creating valuable assets, and keeps audiences showing up, the washed narrative gets weaker. But if the music continues to lose momentum and the biggest conversations around his name remain centered on old beefs, then 50 Cent's argument becomes harder and harder to dismiss. And that is the real battle. Not Rick Ross versus 50 Cent. Not Rick Ross versus Drake. It's Rick Ross versus the version of Rick Ross that everyone remembers. The younger, hungrier, louder version. The version who walked into the game with Port of Miami and made the entire industry pay attention. 20 years later, the question is whether the boss can still create that feeling again. And if he can, the story changes overnight. Because then 50's jokes become background noise. Drake's rivalry becomes history. And Rick Ross gets to prove the one thing he's been saying all along. The long game is still the game. So now the question is simple. Do you think Rick Ross is actually losing his grip on the rap game? Or is 50 Cent focusing on the one scoreboard that makes Ross look vulnerable? And what about Drake? Do you think their old rivalry is still affecting the way fans see Rick Ross today? Or is that chapter already over? Because after nearly 20 years in hip-hop, Ross has already built a legacy that one album, one concert, or one viral clip can't completely erase. But at the same time, the music business doesn't reward history forever. At some point, every veteran has to prove that they can still create moments that matter right now. So drop your opinion in the comments. Is 50 Cent right? Is Rick Ross still the boss? Or is Drake quietly adding even more pressure to a career already under the microscope? If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next major hip-hop story. And most importantly, stay locked in, because if Rick Ross makes his next move, you already know 50 Cent is going to have something to say.